August 2, 1944, midnight. The sky above German-occupied Serbia was black and silent, except for the distant rumble of a single aircraft engine echoing through the mountains. Far below, in a lonely meadow near the village of Pranjani, a faint signal fire flickered against the darkness. For the men waiting beside it, that fire represented hope, rescue, and perhaps their only chance to survive the war. High above, a lone American transport plane circled slowly. The pilot peered down, scanning the terrain for the tiny flame that would confirm he'd found the right spot. If the signal was real, friendly forces were waiting. If it was a trap, German soldiers could be hiding in the forest ready to capture whoever jumped. Then, he saw it. A small orange glow in the middle of a mountain field. He banked the aircraft and lined up his approach. Inside the plane, 3 American operatives prepared to jump. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were members of the Office of Strategic Services, America's secret wartime intelligence agency, the predecessor to the modern CIA. Their mission was one of the most dangerous of the war. The aircraft door opened, and cold night air rushed in. One by one, the 3 men stepped into the void. Their parachutes opened silently and they drifted down into the forests of occupied Serbia. The first man to land was Captain George Musulin. He was 29, tall and powerful, with the build of an athlete and the calm confidence of a veteran operative. Musulin was not only an American officer, he was also the son of Serbian immigrants. He spoke fluent Serbian and understood the culture of the people living in these mountains. Before the war, he was a college football star who helped his team win a national championship. Now, he was standing alone in the darkness of enemy territory. The second man to land was Master Sergeant Michael Rajacich, the mission's radio operator. Like Musulin, he was also a Serbian American and fluent in the language. His job was critical, using portable radio equipment. He would maintain contact with Allied headquarters nearly 300 miles away in Italy. The third man, Specialist Arthur Jibilian, was just 21 years old. He was a brilliant communications expert who would guide aircraft through the night sky using radio signals. The 3 men quickly gathered their equipment, radios, weapons, medical supplies, and survival gear. Within minutes, shadows began emerging from the surrounding forest. Armed men stepped into the meadow. Their uniforms were worn and mismatched. Some carried rifles older than the First World War. Many had long beards and exhausted faces carved by years of fighting. These were not regular soldiers. They were Serbian guerrilla fighters, members of the resistance army known as the Chetnik. After recognizing the Americans as allies, the fighters escorted them through the forest to a hidden farmhouse. Inside, a man was waiting. His name was Draža Mihailović. At 51, Mihailović was one of the most controversial figures of the war. A former colonel, he had led the Chetnik resistance since Germany invaded Yugoslavia in 1941. For 3 brutal years, his fighters had battled German forces from the mountains and forests. Through an interpreter, Mihailović greeted the American officers. "Your men are safe," he said. Musulin looked around the dimly lit room. "How many?" he asked. Mihailović answered calmly, "More than 200. Across the hills and villages of central Serbia, over 200 American airmen were in hiding. They were survivors of bombing missions over Eastern Europe. Their planes shot down by German anti-aircraft fire. Instead of being captured, many had landed in territory controlled by Serbian villagers and Chetnik fighters. Those villagers had made a choice. They chose to hide the Americans. They fed them, sheltered them, and protected them. If the Germans discovered what they had done, the punishment would be death. Entire villages could be burned to the ground. Yet they did it anyway. These airmen had been hiding in barns, basements, and mountain caves for weeks, some for months, waiting for a rescue that might never come. What Musulin had just stepped into was the beginning of one of the most daring rescue operations in military history, a mission later known as Operation Halyard. But just 6 weeks earlier, none of this seemed possible. In late June 1944, at the headquarters of the United States 15th Air Force in Italy, American commanders were facing a crisis. For months, their bombers had been flying long, dangerous missions deep into Axis territory. Their primary target was the massive oil refinery complex at Ploesti in Romania. These oil fields were the single most important fuel source for Nazi Germany. Destroying them could cripple Germany's ability to continue the war, but the cost was enormous. Each mission required a nearly 1,500-mile round-trip flight over heavily defended enemy territory. Many planes never returned. Every week, several American bombers were shot down over Yugoslavia. Aircraft like the B-24 Liberator and B-17 Flying Fortress carried crews of 10 men each. When a plane was hit, survivors had only seconds to parachute out. If they survived the fall, they landed in enemy territory, most destined for prisoner of war camps. But something unusual had started appearing in intelligence reports. Messages from occupied Yugoslavia indicated that dozens of American airmen were not being captured. Instead, they were disappearing into the mountains, hidden by Serbian villages and protected by Chetnik fighters. At first, Allied commanders were unsure whether to trust these reports. By 1944, the political situation in Yugoslavia was extremely complicated. Early in the war, Britain had supported the Chetnik resistance led by Mihailović, but later, British intelligence began supporting a different group of the communist partisans led by Josip Broz Tito. Prime Minister Winston Churchill believed Tito's forces were fighting the Germans more aggressively. As a result, Allied support for Mihailović was withdrawn. Weapons shipments stopped. Liaison missions were recalled. By May 1944, American and British officers had been ordered to leave Mihailovic's territory entirely. But the American airmen hiding in those mountains were still there, waiting, hoping someone would come for them. And that was why George Musulin volunteered for the mission. He had already spent months with Mihailovic's forces in 1943. He had seen firsthand how Serbian villagers treated Allied airmen not as strangers, but as honored guests. They shared what little food they had. They hid them from German patrols. They treated them like family. Musulin knew those men deserved to be rescued, and he was willing to risk everything to bring them home. By early August 1944, the situation in the Serbian mountains had reached a boiling point. More than 200 American airmen, shot down over enemy territory, were scattered across villages and forests near the town of Pranjani. They were hidden by local farmers and protected by the fighters of Draža Mihailović. But with each passing day, the danger grew. German patrols swept through the region relentlessly, searching houses, barns, and mountain paths for any sign of resistance. The Germans knew Allied planes were being lost over Yugoslavia, and they were hunting for the survivors. What they didn't know was that hundreds of airmen were already living among the villagers, waiting for a chance to escape. Captain George Musulin, an American officer sent to coordinate the rescue, quickly saw the immense challenge. Evacuation wasn't as simple as calling in a few planes. The terrain around Pranjani was a nightmare of rugged mountains and thick forests. The few open meadows were uneven, filled with rocks, tree stumps, and soft soil. A large transport plane needed a long, flat runway to land safely, and the nearest airfields were miles away, firmly under German control. Landing a plane directly in these mountains seemed impossible, but the Serbian commander, General Mihailović, had an idea. If there was no runway, they would build one. At first, the suggestion sounded absurd. They had no bulldozers, no heavy machinery, no Allied engineers. Their only resources were the local villagers armed with simple tools, axes, shovels, and teams of horses and oxen. Yet, Mihailović was confident. Serbian villagers had endured centuries of hardship and invasion. They were masters of working the land with their bare hands. Within hours, word spread quietly through the surrounding villages. Men, women, and even children began to gather in the fields outside Pranjani under the watch of Chetnik officers and local engineers. They started the monumental task of transforming a rough meadow into an airstrip. The work was grueling. Trees were felled with axes, their thick roots ripped from the earth. Huge stones were carried away by hand or dragged aside by straining teams of oxen. Every inch of ground had to be leveled as smoothly as possible. Without proper surveying equipment, distances were measured by pacing the field, step by step. The workers relied on a combination of instinct, experience, and sheer determination, and all of it had to be done in secret. German reconnaissance planes flew over the region almost daily. If they spotted any unusual activity or large groups of people in the fields, they would immediately send troops to investigate. Such a discovery would mean disaster for everyone. To avoid being caught, most of the heavy labor was done at night. Under the dim glow of covered lanterns, the villagers worked in near silence. The muffled thud of axes striking wood, the scrape of shovels against dirt, and the quiet commands to the oxen were the only sounds. Children carried buckets of soil to fill holes and level the ground, playing their own small but crucial part in this clandestine operation. During the day, the worksite had to look completely normal. The villagers would scatter, returning to their homes and pretending to be farmers going about their daily routines. Sometimes, German planes would circle low overhead. As the pilots scanned the ground below, the villagers would calmly drive herds of sheep and cattle onto the unfinished runway, making it look like nothing more than an ordinary pasture. This elaborate deception was their only defense. Meanwhile, the number of American airmen in hiding continued to swell. Every few days, new survivors arrived. Some had trekked for days through the mountains after bailing out of their burning planes. Others were escorted by Chetnik fighters who found them lost in the woods. Many of these men were injured. They arrived with broken bones from parachute landings, severe burns from aircraft fires, or wounds from shrapnel. Serbian doctors did what they could, treating the injuries with the limited supplies they had. Homemade bandages, herbal remedies, and sometimes a splash of strong local plum brandy as a disinfectant. Despite their injuries, the airmen were met with incredible kindness. Serbian families, who were already struggling to feed themselves, shared what little they had. Bread, goat milk, vegetables, and the occasional piece of meat were offered freely. Villagers gave the Americans civilian clothes to help them blend in and avoid detection if German soldiers appeared. The airmen were astonished by this generosity. These people had almost nothing, yet they were risking their own lives, and the lives of their families, to protect strangers from a foreign land. Captain Musulin understood the stakes better than anyone. If the Germans discovered the operation, the consequences would be catastrophic. It was common practice for German occupation forces to execute entire villages suspected of helping the Allies. Hundreds of innocent men, women, and children could be slaughtered in retaliation. The runway had to be finished, and it had to be finished quickly. After several days of relentless labor, the field outside Pranjani was slowly starting to look like a usable landing strip. It was about 600 yards long and 40 yards wide. The surface was still rough, but it just might be good enough. Back in Bari, Italy, at the headquarters of the United States 5th Air Force, commanders were preparing the aircraft for the dangerous mission. The planes chosen were Douglas C-47 ski trains. These rugged transports were famous for their durability and their ability to land on short, rough airstrips. They were the best hope for this high-risk rescue. Even so, the pilots knew the danger. Landing a fully loaded C-47 in a narrow mountain field, surrounded by trees, in the middle of the night, left no room for air up. If the approach was too low, they would crash into the trees. If the runway was too soft, the plane could get stuck or flip over. But when the call went out for volunteers, the pilots stepped forward without hesitation. They were determined to bring their fellow airmen home. While the runway was being built, radio operator Arthur Jibilian worked tirelessly. Using his portable transmitter, he sent coded messages to Bari, updating them on the progress of the runway and the growing number of men waiting for rescue. Where there was another constant worry, the C-47s would have to fly across the Adriatic Sea, navigate through enemy airspace, and land in total darkness, guided only by signal fires on the ground. A single storm could delay the entire operation, and the time was running out. German patrols were closing in on villagers reported seeing soldiers questioning farmers about strange activity in the hills. Intelligence suggested the Germans suspected something was happening. There was also another threat approaching. Yugoslavia was torn not only by the German occupation but also by a bitter civil war. The communist partisan army, led by Josip Broz Tito, was advancing, seeking to eliminate Mihailović's Chetnik forces. If Tito's partisans reached the area before the evacuation, the American airmen could become political pawns in a much larger power struggle. The runway had to be ready. Finally, after days of backbreaking work, the villagers completed their impossible task. A crude but usable airstrip now stretched across the meadow. Captain Musulin sent the final, coded message to Bari. The airmen were ready. The runway was ready. All they needed now were the planes. In the deep darkness of the Serbian mountains, hundreds of American airmen waited, listening for the distant drone of engines that would signal the beginning of their journey home. No one knew if the daring rescue would succeed, but they all understood that the fate of hundreds of men and the lives of the villagers who had risked everything to protect them now depended on a handful of brave pilots attempting one of the most dangerous landings of the entire war. By the evening of August 9, 1944, a heavy tension hung over the hills surrounding the small Serbian village of Pranjani in the surrounding forests. Villagers who had risked everything to build a secret airstrip gathered quietly. Nearby, hidden among the trees, over 200 American airmen waited nervously in small groups. No one dared to speak loudly. Every rustle of leaves, every snapped twig, seemed magnified, echoing with danger. German patrols were stationed less than 20 miles away. If they discovered what was about to happen, they could send troops or aircraft within minutes. The entire rescue operation, a beacon of hope for so many, would collapse into a tragedy. Captain George Musulin walked slowly across the dirt runway, a strip of land carved from a mountain meadow by the sheer will of the villagers. He examined the ground carefully, his eyes scanning for any loose rocks or soft patches of soil that might spell disaster for the landing aircraft. Despite days of backbreaking labor, the runway was still rough, a rugged, narrow path. It was barely wide enough for a single transport plane, yet tonight, 4 was scheduled to land. Near the edge of the field, radio operator Arthur Jibilian crouched beside his portable radio transmitter. He carefully adjusted the dials, his ears pressed to the headphones, listening for a signal through the crackle of static. His mission was critical: guide the incoming aircraft from Italy using only Morse code. The planes were flying nearly 300 miles from the Allied base at Bari, across the Adriatic Sea, and deep into German-controlled airspace. They would arrive without lights, landing in total darkness. Their survival, and the survival of the men on the ground, depended almost entirely on Jibilian's radio guidance and a few small signal fires burning at the ends of the makeshift runway. Shortly after midnight, the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. Through the static in his headphones, Jibilian heard a faint signal. The planes were approaching. He began transmitting the final coordinates and instructions, his fingers tapping quickly on the Morse key. The invisible message shot through the night sky, a lifeline guiding the pilots toward the hidden runway in the Serbian mountains. Across the meadow, Chetnik fighters loyal to General Draža Mihailović prepared the landing markers. Small fires were lit at each end of the runway, their flames deliberately kept low to avoid being spotted from a distance. In the forest, the waiting airmen strained their ears, listening, hoping. Then they heard it. A distant rumble. At first it was faint, barely noticeable against the sound of the night wind rustling through the trees. But gradually, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of aircraft engines. 4 Douglas C-47 Skytrain transport planes who were on their way. For the men who had been hiding in the mountains for weeks, even months, it was the most beautiful sound they had ever heard. The first aircraft appeared as a dark shadow moving against the stardusted night sky. The pilot circled briefly, identifying the signal fires before lining up for his approach. He could barely make out the narrow strip of ground carved out between the trees. There was absolutely no room for error. The pilot lowered the aircraft with immense care, the plane descending toward the mountain meadow. Its wheels skimmed over the treetops, so close you could almost imagine them brushing the leaves. Then, with a sudden jolt, the landing gear struck the dirt runway. The aircraft bounced violently once, then twice, before finally settling onto the rough ground. The pilot slammed on the brakes as the plane rolled down the short runway, coming to a stop just feet from the end of the field. For a moment everyone just stared in disbelief. The impossible had happened. The landing had succeeded. Seconds later, the second aircraft appeared, following the same treacherous approach. It too landed roughly, but safely. Then the third plane, and then the fourth. All 4 aircraft had landed successfully on the tiny mountain airstrip. Their engines kept running as the loading operation began immediately. Crew members threw open the side doors and signaled for the waiting airmen to come forward. The hidden groups emerged from the forest, running toward the planes that represented their freedom. Inside each plane, there were no seats for passengers. This was a rescue, not a luxury flight. The airmen would simply sit on the floor or stand, holding onto cargo straps for the journey back to Italy. Each aircraft could carry about 25 men, and the loading had to be executed with lightning speed. German patrols could appear at any moment, turning this miraculous rescue into a massacre. But as the airmen scrambled aboard the planes, something completely unexpected happened. The Serbian villagers began gathering around the aircraft. These were the people who had protected the Americans for weeks and months. They had shared their meager supplies of food, clothing, and shelter, all while facing the constant threat of discovery and execution. Now it was time to say goodbye. Many of the villagers embraced the airmen as if they were family. Some cried openly, tears of joy and sorrow mixing on their faces. Others just smiled proudly, watching these young Americans prepare to finally return home. One elderly woman hugged a young American pilot and pressed a small, precious piece of bread into his hand. "You take," she said softly in broken English. The pilot tried to refuse, knowing the villagers needed that food far more than he did. But the woman insisted, her eyes firm but kind. "For your journey," she said. Nearby, a young Serbian girl removed the scarf from around her neck and handed it to an American bombardier. "Remember us," she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. The bombardier just nodded, a lump in his throat making it impossible to speak. Then, something truly remarkable happened. As the aircraft prepared for departure, many of the American airmen began taking off their own combat boots. They tossed them out of the open aircraft doors toward the villagers gathered on the ground. Dozens of sturdy, leather boots flew through the air and landed on the dirt runway. For the villagers, many of whom wore only simple, handmade footwear that offered little protection against the harsh mountain winters, these boots were an incredible treasure. They were gifts of profound gratitude, small tokens from men whose lives had been saved by the courage of strangers. Soon, the loading was complete. 25 airmen were packed tightly into each aircraft. The doors slammed shut. The engines roared to life, their volume rising to a deafening pitch. One by one, the planes began moving down the narrow dirt runway. The first aircraft accelerated across the field, its engines screaming as the pilot pushed the throttles all the way forward. The plane raced toward the dark line of trees at the end of the runway. For a terrifying moment, it seemed impossible that the heavy aircraft could lift off in time. Then, the nose lifted. The wheels left the ground just seconds before the trees. Branches scraped and screeched against the belly of the aircraft as it climbed into the night sky. The second aircraft followed, then the third, then the fourth. Each plane barely cleared the treetops before disappearing into the darkness above the mountains. Inside the aircraft, the rescued airmen sat silently, a profound sense of disbelief washing over them. They were free. After weeks, even months, of hiding in enemy territory, they were finally on their way home. Back on the ground in Prinjani, Captain Musulin watched the last of the planes vanish into the distance. The first phase of Operation Halyard had succeeded. 100 American airmen had been evacuated in a single, incredible night, but the mission was far from over. More than 100 additional airmen were still hiding in the mountains, waiting for their chance at rescue. And now, the Germans would almost certainly begin searching the area more aggressively. The next evacuations would be even more dangerous. At dawn the following morning, new aircraft would attempt something even riskier: daylight landings. If the Germans spotted the aircraft, they could scramble fighters from nearby air bases, turning the entire operation into a deadly trap. But the Americans and their Serbian allies were determined to continue. Hundreds of lives still depended on the success of the mission, and the skies over Serbia would soon fill again with the beautiful, hopeful sound of approaching aircraft. Dawn broke slowly over the mountains of central Serbia. On August 10, 1944, a thin mist hung over the field surrounding the village of Prinjani. The rough dirt runway, built by hand, lay quiet after a dramatic night evacuation. But for Captain George Musulin, the mission was far from over. Over 100 American airmen had just escaped aboard 4 C-47 Skytrain transport planes, but hundreds more were still hiding in barns, caves, and forest shelters throughout the region. Some had been waiting for rescue for months after parachuting from damaged bombers. The success of the first evacuation brought both relief and a terrifying urgency. German forces hadn't discovered the secret runway yet, but they would soon notice that dozens of American prisoners who should have been captured had simply vanished. The German command in the Balkans wouldn't ignore a mystery like that for long. Meanwhile, the villagers, exhausted from days of heavy labor and sleepless nights, gathered quietly around the airstrip once more. No one complained. They knew what was at stake. The next evacuation flights were already being planned, but this time they would have to fly in daylight. This was far more dangerous. German reconnaissance planes regularly patrolled the skies. If they spotted American transports landing, German fighters would be scrambled to intercept them almost immediately. To counter this threat, Allied planners in Italy organized a protective escort. Dozens of American P-51 Mustang fighters would accompany the transports, sweeping the area for any sign of the enemy. As the sun rose, villagers cleared the runway again, removing stones and packing down soft patches of dirt. Radio operator Arthur Jibilian prepared his transmitter, his link to the Allied command center in Bari across the Adriatic Sea and the surrounding forests. Groups of American airmen waited for the signal. Many had spent weeks living with Serbian families, forming deep bonds with the people who risked everything to protect them. Some airmen even helped with farm work, harvesting crops or caring for livestock. But now, those quiet friendships were about to end as the airmen prepared to leave. Late that morning, the sound of engines returned, but this time, the noise was much, much louder. From the south, a massive formation of aircraft appeared over the mountains. Leading the charge were the sleek silhouettes of P-51 Mustangs, their silver bodies glinting in the sunlight as they swept low across the hills. Behind them, a long line of C-47 transport aircraft stretched across the sky. It was an astonishing sight, more than a dozen planes approaching this tiny, makeshift runway. The fighter escorts immediately began circling the region, scanning for any threat. Some flew low over nearby roads and rail lines, creating a diversion to draw German attention away from Pranjani on the ground. Captain Musulin gave the signal. The first transport lined up its approach. Unlike the night landing, the pilot could now see the narrow runway, but landing a large aircraft in such a confined space was still incredibly dangerous. The plane descended quickly, its wheels hitting the dirt with a heavy impact. Dust and small stones exploded into the air as it rolled to a stop. The crew threw open the side doors, shouting, "Move! Move!" The waiting airmen sprinted across the field and scrambled aboard. Within minutes, the aircraft was full. The engines roared, and the plane accelerated down the short runway, lifting into the sky and turning west toward Italy in safety. Then another plane landed, and another, one after another. The transports touched down, loaded their precious cargo, and departed in a matter of minutes. The process was incredibly efficient. Despite the rough conditions, the pilots performed with remarkable skill. By the end of the day, hundreds more airmen had escaped from occupied Serbia. The rescue was becoming one of the most successful operations of the war, but the danger was growing. German intelligence was starting to suspect that something was happening in the region. Patrols reported increased resistance activity and unusual movements. At the same time, another enemy was closing in. The communist partisan forces led by Josip Broz Tito were advancing. A brutal civil war was raging between Tito's partisans and the Chetnik forces who were helping the Americans. If Tito's army reached Pranjani first, the American airmen could become political hostages, pawns in a struggle for control of the country. Musulin knew it was a race against time. Evacuation flights continued over the following days, some at night, some during the day with fighter escorts. Each flight carried dozens of rescued airmen back to Allied territory. Meanwhile, new landing sites were being prepared deeper in the mountains, just in case the first runway became too dangerous. Once again, villagers worked quietly with axes and shovels, carving new airstrips out of remote valleys. Every single flight was a gamble. German patrols passed dangerously close several times. On one occasion, a German reconnaissance plane flew directly over the area just minutes after an evacuation had finished. If it had arrived a little earlier, the entire operation would have been discovered. But luck and meticulous planning continued to favor the rescuers. By late August, the number of rescued airmen had climbed into the hundreds. For the American pilots returning safely to Italy, the experience was unforgettable. Many later said the bravery of the Serbian villagers who protected them was one of the most inspiring acts of humanity they had ever witnessed. These people had risked execution to save the lives of strangers. As the mission continued, one thing became clear. What had started as a desperate rescue effort was becoming the largest airman evacuation of the entire Second World War. But the final chapters of this incredible story, and the fate of the men who made it all possible, would prove to be just as dramatic as the rescue itself. By late August 1944, a secret rescue operation in the mountains of Serbia had grown beyond anyone's wildest dreams. What started as a desperate attempt to save a few trapped airmen had become something truly extraordinary, with each landing of a rugged C-47 transport plane. More American airmen were being snatched from the clutches of German-occupied territory, but the mission was far from over. Many airmen were still scattered across the countryside, hiding in remote villages sheltered by Serbian farmers who faced certain death if discovered. Captain George Musulin and the resistance fighters under General Draža Mihailović worked relentlessly, organizing flights whenever the weather and enemy patrols allowed. Each evacuation was a nail-biting affair. Planes flew from Allied bases in Italy, crossing the Adriatic Sea and navigating hostile skies into the heart of Yugoslavia. Sometimes they landed at night, guided only by small signal fires lining a dirt runway. Other times, they came in daylight, protected by a screen of American P-51 Mustang fighters. Every single landing was fraught with peril. The makeshift airstrips, carved out of the landscape by villagers, were rough and narrow. The surrounding mountains offered no room for error. Yet, the pilots kept coming back, their courage a perfect match for the Serbian villagers who made it all possible. As summer turned to autumn, the operation expanded. Villagers in other regions worked tirelessly to build new landing strips, cutting down trees, leveling the ground, and camouflaging their work from German reconnaissance planes. These new airfields allowed their rescues to continue even as German patrols intensified their search. Despite the escalating danger, the evacuations went on. One by one, groups of American airmen boarded the waiting planes and flew to safety in Italy. For many, those final moments were profoundly emotional. They said goodbye to the Serbian families who had sheltered them for weeks, sometimes months. Airmen embraced the villagers who had hidden them in barns and basements while German soldiers marched just down the road. They all made a promise. They would never forget what these people had done for them, and for the rest of their lives, many would honor that promise. By early September, the rescue effort had reached a stunning milestone. Over 400 Allied airmen had been safely evacuated. Not a single plane was shot down. Not a single rescue flight failed. It was a remarkable achievement in the midst of one of history's most brutal wars. Finally, on December 27, 1944, the last evacuation flight took off from a hidden airstrip. The mission, officially known as Operation Halyard, was over. In total, 512 Allied personnel had been rescued, including 432 Americans. It was the largest rescue of downed Allied airmen in the entire Second World War. But despite its incredible success, the story didn't have a happy ending. The political landscape of Yugoslavia shifted dramatically after the war. The communist partisan forces, led by Josip Broz Tito and backed by the Soviet Union, seized control. They viewed General Mihailović and his Chetnik resistance as political enemies. In 1946, Mihailović was captured and put on trial in Belgrade, accused of collaborating with the Germans. Many historians now view it as a political show trial, designed to eliminate a rival. Several of the American airmen rescued during Operation Halyard desperately tried to testify in his defense. They explained how Mihailovic's fighters had protected them and organized their escape. But their words were ignored. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. On July 17, 1946, Draža Mihailović was executed by a firing squad. His burial site was kept a state secret. For the rescued airmen, the news was devastating. They believed Mihailović had saved their lives, and now he was being punished for it. Years later, the US government quietly acknowledged his contribution. In 1948, President Harry Truman posthumously awarded Mihailović the Legion of Merit, one of America's highest military honors for foreign leaders. The award specifically cited his role in rescuing hundreds of Allied airmen. However, due to the political tensions of the Cold War, the award remained classified for decades, not publicly revealed until 1967. By then, the heroes of the operation had returned to quiet civilian lives. Captain George Musulin continued a career in intelligence before retiring. Radio operator Arthur Jibilian went back to Ohio, rarely speaking of his role in one of the war's greatest rescue missions. The rescued airmen raised families and built careers, but none of them ever forgot the Serbian villagers who had risked everything. In the decades that followed, several of the airmen returned to Serbia. They went back to the villages where they had hidden, meeting the families who had saved them. Some of those villagers were now elderly, their hair gray, but when they met again, the bond was as strong as ever. They embraced like long-lost brothers. The memory of those dangerous months in 1944 still vivid. In 2015, nearly 70 years after his execution, a Serbian court officially annulled Mihailovic's conviction, ruling that his trial had been politically motivated and unjust. Today, monuments stand in Serbia honoring the courage of the villagers. The fields near Pronjani, where the secret runway once lay, have become places of remembrance. But outside of Serbia and a few military history circles, the story remains largely unknown. The world remembers the great battles of the war, Normandy, Stalingrad, the Pacific Island hopping campaigns, but the quiet miracle that unfolded in the mountains of Serbia is rarely mentioned. 512 men walked out of enemy territory alive. not because of massive armies or powerful weapons, but because ordinary villagers chose courage over fear. They shared food they barely had. They hid strangers in their homes. They risked their own lives, simply because it was the right thing to do. Because of their bravery, generations of families exist today that otherwise never would have been born. That is the true legacy of Operation Halyard, a story of courage, of sacrifice, and a story that deserves to be remembered. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as moving as I did, please like this video and subscribe for more forgotten histories. See you next time.